Hello, my name is DlaB, and I am the creator of the early bound generator. And as such, I guess that means I'm the most appropriate person to be giving a video on how the early bound generator works and how you should be using it. So if that's what you're here for, great! And if you find this video helpful, please let me know, and please add a comment for anything that I missed as well. I can probably answer those comments easier than I can update the video. So I'm going to go through what the early bound generator is, how it works, some of the background of it, and the details of it that may affect how you choose to use it. And then I will be going through all the settings that are involved with it. Tons of settings. So we'll walk through all those, and I'll give a brief overview of what those are, and hopefully you can decide, oh, that's what that does, or oh, that's what I want to use, or oh, I don't want to use that. And hopefully that's something that's helpful for you as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, I'll give a caveat that this is a current as of now. You can see the date in the bottom corner of my screen is 7/8/2024. So it's current as of now, which means that it may be updated, it may change, it may be different. It probably will be updated. I continue to maintain this. So just know that this may not be the latest and greatest, but this should be a great overview of what it can do. And most of the details will change only minor in the future. So also quick call as well. This is for the early bound generator v2. I will refer to it always as the early bound generator, since the only reason I made a v2 is because there are some breaking changes between v1 and v2, and I wanted to make sure anyone that wanted to make that jump from v1 to v2 would do it at their own leisure and wouldn't have to worry about anything breaking. So I'm not maintaining v1 again at all. I'm not planning to do any updates for it. And it's just out there for people that are currently using it. So if you are wondering, oh, v1, v2, what should I use? Definitely use v2. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So starting at the beginning, the early bound generator is a tool for the XrmToolBox. If you don't already have the XrmToolBox installed, go to the www.xrmtoolbox.com and install it from there. And once you get installed, you need to install the early bound generator. To do that, you'd click on the configuration button here and go to the tool library. And you can start by typing in early if you'd like. Make sure you may not have it show up sometimes if you already have it installed or you've unchecked one of these things. So the show tool is not installed yet. That'd be the one that would be the primary one that you want to make sure you have that installed. So type in early, and you can see all the early bound generators that are included within the XrmToolBox, or the tools that exist. Some of these are great. I haven't used them at all because I've got my own tool. But anyway, you click on the early bound generator. You want v2, as I mentioned before. Click that and click to install it. And that's all it's going to do. It's going to install that, and you'll have to restart the XrmToolBox when that happens. Okay, so now you have the XrmToolBox installed. The next question is, well, what is it and how does this work? What is this magic, right? So well, first let's start off with the help. So the help here, you can go ask for help on the early bound generator, clicking this link, and that will give you some documentation on the GitHub. And I'll update this video. Right now, this one is pointing to an old Codeplex version of the video, way back in the day. But this gives you some details on what it is, and that may get updated in the future as well. But that's kind of like help. And the other one you may want, and especially if you find a bug, is feedback. If you have any feedback, that'll open up a link to be able to enter in a bug here, or enter in whatever feedback if you want to give any feedback on something. Hey, this is an issue, something I want, so it needs to be done, and it'll pre-populate it with the details for you already, as far as the version of the XrmToolBox you have and the tool version, so I don't have to wonder, hey, are you on the correct version or not? So anyway, that's just the help section. And that's on actually any tool within the XrmToolBox has the ability to have those sort of links. So that's the first step. Next step, let's talk through how it works. And I'm going to first call your direction to the settings path here. This is probably the most important thing to understand when you're using the XrmToolBox and using the early bound generator in this case. And that is that the whole purpose of this tool is to populate the XML settings and read from and populate the XML settings to be used to then populate these builder settings. In the early version, in version 1 of the early bound generator, everything was ran off these XML settings, and there was no JSON settings. in the version 2, and the big difference between version 2 and version 1 is version 2 uses the model builder as a part of the PAC CLI. If you don't know what those are, look them up. Great tools from Microsoft, but that's the key point to call out here is that I am actually using underneath the covers the Microsoft supported product, the Microsoft supported DLLs, the Microsoft supported connection methods. So I don't have to worry about maintaining those or keeping those up to date. I don't have to worry about security issues because if there are any that exist, Microsoft will support that. So that makes my life happy and should make you happy as a user of the product. That it's not just me, it's Microsoft below the covers is actually doing most of the hard work for me. So anyway, this XML settings path, what is this thing? This thing stores all these settings, and that's basically all it's doing. It's pretty simple. It may be a little bit lengthy, but pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and by default, when you are brand new and you have a brand new instance, you're going to have just some generic settings. So it'll just be these generic settings. Like you can click this button to go to that. This resets to default. It'll be a generic settings and a generic settings file, and it will be configured just with out of the box what my probably suggested best practices are. Not that you shouldn't change it, but those best practices. The key part here is that everything in here is driven off of where this path is set. Okay. So right now it's in my user directory, DLaB, source repos, DLaB, XRM unit test example, XRM XYZ to XRM blah, 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 blah. This is an example project I have for my XRM unit test source code. And just an example project that I use for this and other things as well, because it basically is how I do all my development for the Dataverse platform for model-driven apps. In this case, the best recommended approach here is that you make sure to put your XML file here into a folder that's under your source control and is most likely in the same folder or subfolder where you're actually generating your early bound files. So you'll see right here, I'm in this folder, and if I open up Visual Studio for this project, you see this is the path to the folder. Notice I have all my entities created here, all my messages or actions are created here, and my option sets are created here. These paths are all dependent on where this thing sits. So because it sits here, if I look for the path for my entities, you will see it's just listed here as entities. Same thing for the option sets, just listed as option sets. And messages is listed as messages. Okay? So if I wanted to put that at a different path, it would all be relative on this file. So if you want to put up a file, up a folder or down a folder, you could use relative pathing to do that. The .. / to go up a folder, or just add in slashes to go down folder into subfolders. Okay? So that's the first thing to call out as, hey, this is different. This is something to be concerned about, or something to know. So we can look real quick at what this file looks like, and I'm going to open that up in my Notepad++. And it's just a basic XML file with the settings from the config. And the key point to point out here is that I do try to be as friendly to your Git compares as possible. So these long lists will have separate lines for each one of these items that are listed here. That way you can see, oh, this got added or this got removed. If it was on a single line, it's really hard to see what changes actually happened in the XML. So besides that, it's just basic XML, nothing fancy about it. So if you ever wanted to edit it by hand, you could. Also, just to point out that this is something that is designed to allow it to be run via command line as well. So just call that out. But that is the XML path. And I mentioned before that it's using the PAC CLI. And how does it actually do that? Where does it actually find that? It's a great question as well. If you go to the tool, the settings under configuration here for the XrmToolBox, and go look at paths, you can open up the XrmToolBox folder. Nope. So if you go to the actual storage folder here, you'll see plugins. in other plugins, you will see first the DLL in this folder for the early bound generator v2. So this is the actual DLL that's used to load that form. But then there's a subfolder in here, and in here you will see all the Microsoft DLLs that are required in order to use the model builder. So the Microsoft.powerplatform.dataverse.modelbuilder.lib.dll, this is the DLL that's used by the PAC CLI to generate your model. So it's used in here, and then it's called via the XrmToolBox to generate the actual early bound files that you need. So just call out on that. Not that you ever need to change it. The only thing you may need to change is if you wanted to mess around with the dictionary file. I'll talk about that later. And yeah, if you ever had to do your own custom alphabet for transliteration for option sets, you may want to touch that as well. But ideally, you do it once, and then you'd send me the file, and then I would include it in the next version of the early bound generator, so you wouldn't have to maintain that going forward, and everyone in your language locale would be able to reuse that. So anyway, but that's getting too deep in what I want to get to for right now. So just calling out that's where that's running, and those are the DLLs that are being used. Oh, one other thing to point out in that is that there are also my DLaB DLLs in here. So these DLaB. These are the DLLs that are in addition to the ones Microsoft provides, and they're the ones that are going to be responsible for extending the model builder. So you can use the model builder by itself in the PAC CLI. It does not have all the features that the early bound generator has because these are extensions to that model builder. You can also create your own extensions, and you can also manage that as well. I'll get into that in settings about if you ever wanted to change the settings and maybe use some of my settings, but some of your settings, some of your DLLs, you could do that. So very, very configurable. So we already looked at the settings path, what this is. Let's look at these buttons here real quick. This resets the settings to default. So if you're brand new to this and you make some changes and, oh, I'm not sure what I wanted, you can click that button and give you back to the default. Or, hey, what was the default? Let me see. What was the default namespace? I can click that. Oh, it's Dataverse model. Okay, and I can click the reload to reload from the settings file if I want to do that. So, yeah, just be careful with that because it will auto-save whenever you close the tool or whenever you generate the early bound generator settings, it will auto-save as well. So just be aware that if you reset it, that you've got it backed up under source control somewhere, or else you may lose those settings. And then the open existing file. So this will, if you want to open up a different file, another key thing to point out here is that this file is specific to the actual connection that you're using in the XrmToolBox. So in the XrmToolBox, in order to generate these settings, you need to connect to an org. And when you connect to the org and you set the settings, it will link for you specifically the path for that environment to the settings path. So if you happen to have multiple clients you're working on as a contractor or something like that, you can have multiple settings files and multiple repositories, and based on the connection, it will automatically use the right settings, which is a really, really handy feature. But yes, so if you wanted to put this in a correct location, you could open the existing file folder, find the file, and copy it over to where you want to do it and open it from there. And the final one here is to save. So this is really designed to save it to a new location, but if you wanted to save it over the top of itself, you could easily do that as well. That would force a save. But anyway, that's the 4 buttons here at the top for the settings. Now, the model builder does not use my custom XML settings. It does use this JSON relative path settings here. This builder.json. So it's key that that one is the one that's actually being used, and that just know that hey, this is used to load the settings for the XrmToolBox early bound generator, the actual GUI, but for it to actually run, it needs the builder settings.json. So if you ever want to run this from the command line, you don't need XrmToolBox at all, but you will need to probably use this to generate your builder settings.json. You can manually generate it if you want, way easier just to use the tool to do it, and then you could probably maintain it going forward pretty easily, doing it through just a text editor. But again, if there's any new features to come out, you probably want to be updating with the builder settings.json. And then if you check that into source control and any other developers on your team are accessing it and wanting to regenerate it, you all have the same builder settings.json that you're running off of. So highly important that you understand what this path is and what it's used for. And it's relative, again, to the path of the XML file that's generated. Okay. And if you do need to run this, or you do want to run this as a part of a build script on a build server somewhere, you do not need the UI at all. You do not need to try to extract out the UI DLLs from the tool itself. There is a NuGet package of earlyboundgenerator.api that you can go ahead and use to download just the DLLs required for generating the model builder interface stuff. So just those extension DLLs. So it doesn't include any dependencies on the XrmToolBox, and so everything's clean that way. And I keep that up to date in sync with the actual XrmToolBox version of the tool, and just don't always push that out if there are only UI changes that don't affect the actual builder. So sometimes it will look like it's a version behind, and the reason is that there's a version change to the UI that doesn't affect the builder itself. So let's say I change what this display name is. That won't affect you running from the command line because you won't ever see it. It's not needed. If I update the version of the XrmToolBox, it won't affect you at all. So sometimes those versions will be out of sync, but when they are in sync, they will have the same version, and the reasons they would be out of sync is it doesn't really matter. It's not needed. So just calling out that as well, that you can get the bits, the DLLs that you need just via the NuGet API package. And before we really start diving into the settings, I will call out the environment that you want to generate your earlybound files out of. Generally, there's one development environment. Sometimes you have on a team with multiple developers and each of your own developer environment. That's fine. You can always just generate for your own local development until you're good to go. And then as a part of the process, though, you're going to be pushing your changes from your local dev into an actual dev gold or some other build merge place where everybody's changes gets merged into. So I recommend, if it's possible in your process, to go through and push the changes to that gold environment and then build out of that environment when you go to check your changes in the model builder, the early bound generated files, to check them from that dev environment, that gold environment, that single environment that everybody uses. So for example, let's try to call it out here. So if I've got my own dev box here, dev box here, dev box here, we got 3 devs. Let's put it in the same spot here. Okay. And then we have this dev gold here. All right. Let's say I add a table here and I'm working on this, that's fine. I would use the early bound generator and point to my dev environment and say, hey, actually let's use a blue one for that. Hey, run from here. I run, everything's happy, everything looks good. And if I want to, I can go ahead and check those changes in, and then we have to merge the changes. I don't ideally like to merge the changes, if at all possible. So what really should happen is you should have a process where you say, hey, this looks great as far as the metadata for the tables that I have, the columns that I have, the option sets that I have, the custom actions, API calls that I have. And I'm going to push them to my dev gold environment, my main dev environment that everyone shares. And then from there, you can have the process as a part of your build script. Could rerun it, or you could just rerun it manually and then check in your changes. So those are kind of that would be the recommended approach for doing that. That I would do it, hey, you run it here for your local stuff, and then when you're ready to go out, actually push your changes in, get the metadata pushed to the actual main environment, and then rerun the generation of your early bound files. So that's what I highly recommend doing. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the only way that's valid, and that doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, but that does alleviate you from having to do any sort of manual merging of your early bound files, which is very helpful. Another thing I'll call out is that you don't have to keep your early bound files in sync with the actual server. And what I mean is, if you happen to have a new column that you've created in your local dev environment and that gets checked in, that's fine as long as no one attempts to populate that value or query for that value in their code. If they don't ever do that, then that's fine. It's just an extra attribute and it's just sitting out there doing nothing. So you don't have to worry about it being in sync. And so basically, you have the same sort of compatibility issues you would have if you were doing late bound, early bound. There's no new compatibility issues. It's only if you are using a column that gets removed, you actually get a build error this time rather than a runtime error, which is great. And then if you are attempting to use a file that you've generated for, not a file, but an attribute you actually generated already that doesn't exist, it'll compile just fine, but then when you actually go to run and use it, it'll blow up saying, hey, this attribute doesn't exist on this table. It's the same exact error you get as a late bound. So there's no penalty to doing that. There's no issue to doing that. Nothing at all. So you're still highly recommend keep on using early bound and don't have to worry about potential issues with it not being 100% matching. The other one would be if you happen to change attribute type. So using like the attribute manager, one of my other tools, if you happen to use that to say, hey, this int is now going to be a decimal, and you try to populate actually switch around. This decimal is now going to be int, and you populate it with a decimal value, and then when you go to actually put it in the environment, it goes, hey, this is only an int value, you'll get an error. And again, that's the same error you get with late bound. So it's not any new errors, you just are much more likely to catch them ahead of time because it's early bound. So anyway, calling that out. All right, so let's go ahead before we actually dive into settings and actually generate it and see what happens. So we click this generate button, so the loading window runs up, and it's actually going to go to the server, it's going to go get your metadata on that environment that you're connected to, and it's going to go generate your early bound settings, early bound files based on that metadata. You'll see at the top also that you do get your actual command line. So although this is ran through the XrmToolBox and it doesn't shell out, early bound generator v1 used to shell out, and because there was no way to call the CM service util directly, now with the model builder, it can be referenced via DLL and you don't have to shell out. So it's actually calling it directly, but it does spit out the actual command line. So if you do want to run this as a part of a build process, you've got everything here already. You've got the command line here, PAC Model Builder build, output directory, and you have the, hey, where's this going to go? The settings template file. This is a JSON file, that's it. So, hey, where are we going to spit everything out, and where is the path to the JSON file? So, copying this and running this command line, as long as you have an auth set up for the PAC util to connect to it, it's going to go through and run just fine, exactly the same way as it does in the tool. So just calling that out, that's what it's doing. So if you ever wanted to be able to use it as a command line argument in anything, super easy to do. You just need to get that all set up with the PAC CLI and then call that code command line. So super easy. And then here you have some information about things that are being generated. A lot of the stuff is just something that's done by default by Microsoft. I don't have a lot of control out of it, but I spit it out here just in case something ever pops up. If you do have errors, those do show up and so forth. So, and then at the end of it, you do see, okay, wrote 45 message entities, 8 messages, processed 8, skipped 6, wrote 2, 11 global option sets, wrote those as well, and then hey, completed how long it took? 4 seconds. So I generated 45 entities in 4 seconds. A lot of people that use late bound say, oh, it takes too long to generate. 5 seconds? 5 seconds doesn't seem that long to me. And then just everything you get out of it is just so much better. So anyway, that is what happens. It generates everything. It generates your entities, your option sets, and your messages, or your API call, early bound files. So the early bound generator v2 used to have separate buttons. There's no reason for that. Just have one. So I switched it over, just have one button, just generates everything. So makes life simple that way. So now that we've gone through basically everything about the tool ahead of time, let's go through the details of the tool. So by far, your best friend here is going to be the search box, where if you're trying to figure out, oh, is there any like setting on something, like what's available for the name? Oh, here's naming stuff. You can go through and do that, and it'll filter over all the settings, those names. So that's going to be your friend. Let me collapse some stuff. We'll call some other things out as well. I tried to organize things in a way that makes sense. There's things that are global that applies to everything, entities. Is specific to generating the class files for your tables. Option sets is specific for generating your choice definitions. And I guess we can probably get some history in here. Back in the day, in the CRM days, not the Dataverse days, CRM days, the Dataverse tables were called entities, and the Dataverse choices were called option sets. Microsoft has renamed those in the marketing part of it, but they haven't renamed in the actual SDK. So they're all option sets and entities underneath the covers. And until that day, Microsoft decides through the SDK, hey, let's go ahead and change the name conventions of these things. I will stick with what's in the actual code, since that's what developers look at. Metadata just strictly says what version of the early bound generator you have, and then the settings. The settings file keeps track of its version as well. because that's used to determine what happens in an upgrade scenario. When you want to upgrade from one version to the next, there are some settings that may need to get brought in, may need to get manipulated, may need to get changed. I try to do that all for you so you don't have any issues and no broken builds with the update. And then service generation extensions, these are the ones that you can list to say, hey, these are the DLLs that are used by the extensions for the model builder. So in the model builder, you can define a custom code generation service, or a customization service, or a writer filter service. There's all these services you can define. I've implemented them all and listed them here. If you ever want to create your own and extend that a little bit more, you can always do that and create your own. You can even reference my DLLs and extend them with your own, and then you just need to update this to say, hey, I'm going to use my specific DLL, my specific service interface, instead of the one provided by the early bound generator, and go on your happy way. You don't have to change anything. You can still use the tool while using your own custom source code. And the final one down here is the debug stuff. This is stuff that like if you want to change the model builder log level, you could do that. Be careful in that, as if you go too low, it will spit out a whole bunch of stuff and will take minutes to put all the information in the text box here. So I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you really want to see what's going on. These final ones here are ones I use for debugging specifically. The read serialized metadata allows you to be able to, well, actually, first, it's the serialized metadata is the one that you probably want to look at first. This is allowing you to actually store off the metadata that gets retrieved on disk and then be able to reuse it going forward. So I use it personally for myself when I am trying to debug something. Maybe I want to go on a plane and like, hey, this isn't working. I can save off the serialized metadata so it doesn't actually have to make a connection to the server. And then I can run that whenever I want to run that and not have to be connected and have an internet connection to a instance of Dataverse in order to be able to get that information. So so I turn that on to true, I run it, it saves off my metadata, and then I can turn it to false and turn that to true, and it will read from the metadata, which is really happy. It really makes life simple. The other time it may be useful is if there is some bug that I'm seeing, that you are seeing, that I am not seeing, and I can't recreate. I may ask for you for your serialized metadata. And say, go and you run this, and there's a how-to in the GitHub for it, but you go and you run it, and you'd be able to serialize it and be able to hand it off to me. And that way I'd be able to rerun exactly what you are seeing on my machine without access to any in your environment. I just have access to your metadata, which is your table structure and columns, which shouldn't be an issue. So anyway, I can't imagine of any way to use that information that would be beneficial to anybody. So anyway, so those are what those are for. The update builder settings JSON. This is something that if you want to be able to configure things but not actually update the builder JSON settings, so you're actually like running it manually or you're configuring it manually, you could do that. Primarily, this is me just when I was using debugging to do that. So you don't really want to use that at all. And then wait for attached debugger. Again, this is something that was actually very, very helpful in V1 of the early bound generator, because it would sit and wait until you've actually attached a debugger before it would continue. You can still use it in here. It's not quite as necessary because you can attach your debugger to the XrmToolBox to begin with before you click anything and put a breakpoint in yourself. So it isn't needed as much, but I do keep it in here just in case there is some reason to use it going forward. And if you do change that to true, it will just hang there and you'll have to kill XrmToolBox until you actually attach a debugger. So probably don't want to touch that one. So, but anyway, those are kind of these three at the bottom, the ones that are probably never going to be touched by you, and that's great. But there's primarily for me and debugging and some other purposes as well. But let's go ahead and start at the very top here for the global. Now, as I mentioned, the search here is going to be your great tool to figure out what settings exist. The next thing that's helpful here, and I've already used it a few times already, is this section down here. And this is the description. So every single one of these settings, I include a description. If you ever read the description and you say, I have no idea what that means, put a comment, go to help and say feedback and say, I have no idea what this means. Can you explain it to me? Because if you're having a problem, everybody else is having a problem. And I've been working with this thing for almost a decade now. And so I've been living and breathing, and you just kind of forget what people don't know and what people don't assume. And so I need that feedback. So please give that feedback if you can at all. So one feature this feature here is the Add New Files to Project. This is the idea that it will automatically add any files that get generated to your CS project file. This was more important back in the day before the new .NET Standard project files, where you had to list every single file. Now it just uses the folder to automatically add things based on the folder. But if you do use the older standard, that is helpful for that to just automatically add it to the project for you. The one bug here, and I will kind of pull out here, is that for shared project files, sometimes Visual Studio will like cache it and not allow you to edit it, or maybe it overrides it. And so it actually doesn't look like it works. And so in that case, I found that you have to like actually unload the shared project file within Visual Studio or shut down Visual Studio in order for that to be 100% work 100% of the time. For me, it's more of a hassle to shut this down and restart it than it is just to go into Visual Studio and add any missing files that are missing manually. So to each their own. But that's what this Add New Files to Project are. Audible completion notification. So back in the day when you were using the CRM Service Util, it downloaded your entire metadata, which could take a very long time. Now, Microsoft changed it so that it only downloads what it needs in order to generate your early bound settings, early bound files. And so as a part of that, this probably isn't needed as much, but hey, it is nice to say, hey, this is finished. It does need to get turned off in certain scenarios when you're running on a server that doesn't have any sound installed. It'll actually error. So that is one reason why that's a setting to turn off, because it's required in some certain situations. So anyway, by default, it's turned on. You can turn it off. So anyway, that's what that is. Builder settings JSON relative. As I mentioned before, this is just the relative path to the XML path for this builder settings.json. And that's what's actually going to, when you click the generate, the first thing it's going to do, it's going to suck all the settings it has and shove them into the JSON file, and then call the JSON command line up here that it's doing here. Not the JSON, but the actual file to evoke this model invoker and generate your files. So that's the first thing it does is it builds it. That way it can utilize that settings going forward. Camel case class names. Okay, so this is an answer to one of the most annoying things that I've had with early bound generating file names and other things, is the camel casing of it. It's so much nicer as a developer to have things camel cased, because you don't have spaces and it's hard to read things. And so having things camel cased makes life a lot easier. Unfortunately, there's no good way of ensuring that things are camel cased correctly, because everything is usually done based off the schema name. Not the logical name, the schema name. And the schema name you have to explicitly set, and when you set it once, you can't change it, which means that if I forget to capitalize it when I'm doing it, that messes things up. It won't be generated with that capital name. And the other issue would be, and then the other kind of the bad thing with that is, a lot of the times people will make all of their schema names lowercase so they know exactly on the web API front what casing to use. I don't really like it, but hey, people do use it. And so that's a setting there to be able to, or by default, it's going to use the schema name, but I don't like that. I want to be able to configure that mainly outside of what the actual schema name is. So that's what this camel case class names thing's all about. It will attempt to use a dictionary, this dictionary file listed right here, to go through and attempt to parse each value, each text value, into its words, and then camel case those appropriately. Is it perfect? No. Is it really good? Yeah, actually I think it's really good. Is it configurable? Yes, you can configure it and be exact with how you want to actually generate it. So it involves a little more tweaking, but I think the end result is much cleaner and much better, more readable. So one thing I also play out here is if we change a value here, and there are settings that aren't actually used by anymore, you will actually see things hide. So let's see here, which one that will do that. So if I look down at the option sets here, there is an option here for generate one file per option set. And as I change that, you'll see that you will lose this group local option sets by entity. Sometimes settings are completely dependent on something else. And so like only use if create one file per option set is true. By default, that should only show up if that is there. So you may see things that are hidden, or you may not see things that exist because you've got some other setting disabled, and that is dependent on that setting. Similarly with like the create one file per entity, you also notice that it does change the relative output path as well, because it used to be a folder because you're creating one file per entity, so you're going to create lots of files in a folder. But if you create one, if it's false, then that means you're going to create one actual file, which is going to have to be a file rather than a folder. So anyway, just calling that out, that you may see some things change when you change settings. And in this case, camel case and names, I do need to update this, where it should actually hide these other settings. So anyway, that's what the camel case class names is done. The camel case custom words. So by default, this dictionary is one that's going to get updated by me all the time. If I have new words or new things that come out, or hey, this should be updated, I will update that, which means that I don't want to override your changes. That's also another reason why this one is actually relative to if you look at this one, it's relative to the plugins folder in the XrmToolBox, not relative to the actual settings path. And I should also call out that this is actually relative to the exe as well. So when you're running the model-driven PAC CLI, this is just going to be in the folder of that PAC CLI. So it's going to be in that folder as well. So yeah, just calling that out. Okay, so camel case custom words. You can go through here and add in custom words that you want to have camel cased. And that's just the preferred method of doing is adding a correct word. So let's say that I want to camel case my states, U.S. states. So I want Michigan to be a camel case word. I want Alabama to be a camel case word, and pull that out rather than being something else. You could potentially do that. It's also helpful for things like, let's say XML. That might be a good one. So I don't want XML to be capitalized as this, but I wanted to see it as an actual word. I say, all right, XML is a word. So far more often this is being used for abbreviations, especially if there's something that's being used specific to your implementation. Let's say you're dealing with disorders and you want to have OCD out there, right? So rather than having this think that, oh, this is some weird word and trying to parse it correctly, it's going to go, oh, OCD, that's a word, and it's going to capitalize that as OCD rather than as something else. So that's the primary way that you want to try to tweak anything when it comes to camel casing. This is just a list of all English words in a dictionary. That becomes as a part of the earlier bound generator. So just calling that out. The camel case member names. So this is the class names that are camel case. These are the member names. So you could do that individually one way or the other, and that's why they're not there. I think better they're both false. Yes, okay. So if I camel case, if I send them both as false, then all the other camel case stuff goes away. But if one of them is true, then I need the other information for that. So just calling out that you can do the class names different than the member names. You can do them different ways. Lots of times I see this happening when you are transitioning from an older version of the early bound generator or a different version of it, and you have all these member names that are not camel cased, and it's a lot of work to go through and update those. You can just do the class names, and that way you get at least somewhere closer, and it's a lot easier to do that than maybe the member names. Delete files from output folders. So the idea of this is that whatever you generate is what exists in those folders. And so if you want to go through and say, hey, I want to clean up anything that's out there. So if I remove from the entities selection here, so down here you have that white list of the entities. If I happen to remove one of these entities that are being generated, then I want to remove the file itself automatically. And that's what this is supposed to do, delete files from output folders. It's kind of dangerous. I'll leave it off by default, but maybe it's something you do want to use and play around with. So you can change that to true. File prefix text. If you need to have some copyright information at the top of your file prefix text, or say this was generated by yada yada yada, you can put in your prefix text of this is mine, don't change it, or whatever text you want to actually put in there, you can put in there as your prefix text, and it'll be generated for every single file. Generate types as internal. Sometimes people want to have internal types from the public types. This happens a lot if you happen to have more than one set of early bound definitions that you're using. You might want to actually keep some as internal, and that way they don't get used by something else. Include command line. This will include the command line at the top of the classes. This was much more beneficial back in the day with the CRM service util than it is with the PAC CLI because there's a lot more information that's involved in that command line. For this one, it's not used as much, and that's why it's false by default. This is a rather new feature that still needs a little bit of tweaking. It works if you happen to be using a .NET Core project. If you're on a VB6 project, or on VB6, the 4.6 project, and you are using that for a plugin, it doesn't quite work there yet. I've got a couple bugs and things I need to fix in that to be able to make it correctly generate those nullable types. So anyway, that is something that is coming down the pipe, and I would like to have in the future. So namespace, all the entities, option sets, and messages are all in the same namespace. And the reason is that they depend on each other. Theoretically, I guess messages could get moved down to a different one, but for now, that's the way it's always been generated. So you can create your own namespace. Usually I recommend your company name, and then, XRM because it's short, but Dataverse or model or whatever, entities, and get your namespace that way. So, but whatever you want. Output relative directory. So I mentioned by default, everything is done off of the settings path. If there is some reason where you want to be a separate path that's not the settings path, then you can populate this output relative path directory, and that's going to use that path instead to be the actual path that's used to define where everything else is located. So, project name for early bound files. This is optional here, but if you are wanting to automatically add files to the project, it will attempt to find it for you automatically. If you set that to false, that will go away. But if you set it true, it will attempt to add the files automatically that get generated. And if it can't find the project correctly, it's in some weird folder, nested some way it's not expecting, then you will need to just give it this project name for it to be able to go and find the actual file. So not used very often, but sometimes could be used. The remove runtime version, this is a comment that gets generated all the time. I don't see much use in it, and I have that set to, hey, remove it. And it's being generated at the very top of the files that I mentioned before. Also, there is an auto-generated header comment that gets generated. Again, I don't really see a use for it outside of maybe someone knows that it's auto-generated, but usually it's pretty quick to pick up, hey, this is auto-generated. So you can turn that off. And then the suppress code generated attribute. There's an attribute that gets added that says, hey, this is a code generated thing, and it contains the code generation engine and version. That will get really annoying when you upgrade the early bound generator to a new version, or the model builder of that gets upgraded, because it'll change the version numbers, which makes all your files look like they've been changed. And for a simpler, cleaner Git history, I turn that off by default, but you may choose to keep it. Token capitalization overrides. So if the camel case word, custom words, doesn't work for you, you can't get it to work quite right, or maybe you want it to specify something as a word but camel case it slightly differently, that's where the token capitalization overrides comes in. And so what this allows you to do is to specify, hey, I want to call out things explicitly. So for example, FedEx. This is the normal capitalization of FedEx, capital F, capital E, FedEx. That's a parcel company that delivers stuff in the United States and around the world. So if you don't know it, you're kind of surprised because they're worldwide, but hey, that's what it is. That would be the correct capitalization of FedEx. If you say, hey, FedEx is a word, then you've got to put the whole thing in, and then it's going to capitalize it like this, which isn't what you want. You want to have it capitalized like that. You could put in the words of Fed and X, but then that means anytime that it sees something that's EX, it may try to call that a word, and then it's going to mess up the rest of the parsing. So just some things to actually call out there for that. And sometimes you run into things where you've got longer words that it will attempt to create as a longer word, and like, oh, no, this is an issue. This needs to be capitalized a certain way. Things that are very useful for is capitalizing particular prefixes I found. I like having the M, D, and M of Microsoft Dynamics Marketing capitalized that way. But that's not a word. It shouldn't be tried to be parsed as a word. It should be, hey, this is a token. This is the way this should be set up to be parsed. Voicemail, another one. Voice and mail are both words, but voicemail should be capitalized as such. Theoretically, if you add voicemail as, actually no, because we do want to capitalize the mail now. So, but voicemail actually is one word. So that's the issue there. That's why we have to go through and add that there. So anyway, that is what those capitalization overrides do is allows you to be able to explicitly call out what capitalization you want for a particular set of text, and that text overrides anything else. So that's going to guarantee to be capitalized that way if you put that in there. And then finally, use display name for BF name. Business process flows are horribly named by default. It has the GUID as the actual name, which makes it horrible for utilizing it because it's going to create those classes with that name. This will go through and say, hey, this is a business process flow. I'm not going to capitalize it the way I normally or I'm not going to generate the name. I normally generate it with the GUID. I'm going to use a display name instead. So that's that. All right. We have entities and object sets, and then we're done. Everything that I can teach you, I've taught you. So add debugger non-user code. Sometimes when you're debugging things, you step into the property, and you don't want to step into the property when you're debugging things for an entity. So I go look at the entity here. Let's go find an actual class. So sometimes if you, depending on what your debug settings are, you may be stepping over a line of code or wanting to step over a line of code that's getting the city or setting the city. And when you push F11, it's going to step into this thing, this line here. I don't have any idea why you'd ever want to step into this, ever. So this debugger non-user code will go through and say, hey, this is non-user code. It shouldn't be debugged. So if you have your settings debugged to say, hey, don't debug, step into non-user code, it will consider this non-user code and won't step into it. It's primarily going to be used if you're using a shared project, like what I'm doing here. It will not be used as much if you are using a normal project and you're generating it. And so at that point, it'll be a separate DLL, and you won't step into that separate DLL. But if you are using shared project, it is needed for that. So, attribute blacklist. If you want to not include specific attributes, you can do that here. And it's a wildcard kind of idea here. So let's say, for example, you've installed some other third-party vendor. Let's say that vendor name is, let's call it Acme. If you do this Acme star here, it's going to go through and not generate any attributes that begin with Acme underscore, which makes it very easy to eliminate all this other stuff from your early bound generated classes. So very, very helpful thing to do there, and you can add whatever settings you want, multiple lines for that, but that's where I see that being used. Let's say also maybe you've installed some Microsoft solution that contains a whole bunch of attributes that you don't want in your early bound entities, then you can exclude those and not generate those. Attribute capitalization override. So this was made, actually this is done before. If you don't use the camel cases, this will still be used here. But if you do use it, it'll use it as well. But it allows the ability to override the capitalization of an attribute and entity. It's kind of slow and kind of clunky because you have to specify every entity and attribute. You could edit it via the XML, or maybe a little bit faster. But I primarily recommend using the global camel casing ability over this. Create one file per entity. Oh, this is something that is the bane of people all over. By default, the CRM service util would go through, and this is the early bound generator v1, would go through and create a single file with everything in it, which made it easy to generate the file, but it made it horrible for Visual Studio. Visual Studio does not like opening a 100 megabyte CS file. It's not like parsing it, doesn't like anything about it. So that was removed as a part of the model builder to be able to go through and generate those files. It generates a single file per entity. In order to maintain backwards compatibility, I do allow that here. So I do have the setting here, and it will actually go and generate every file separately and then go back through and merge it all together into a single file. So it'll take a little bit longer, but if you do have some love with a single ginormous file with everything, you can still do that. Virtual attributes. So there are some. So virtual attributes are the attributes that get generated. They're actually not part of the entity, but they look like they are. So these are like naming of things for like option sets and stuff. To see the actual display name, those are what the virtual attributes are. So if you want to see the display name for things as an actual attribute, you can do that rather than actually having to access it directly from the formatted values. So it's kind of a nice feature. I've included it there by default. But yeah, that's the emit virtual attributes. Okay, then we get to some blacklisting, whitelisting for entities. So there was multiple camps of, hey, do you want to exclude the entities that you should generate? Do you want to include the entities you should generate? How do you specify that? I provide both a black and a white list. So if you want to say, give me everything except for this, back in the day, that made a lot more sense when there wasn't a whole lot to exclude, and you constantly want to add whatever is new. I just want to automatically add it. That's what the blacklist was kind of for. I don't see that being used as much. And also, if you need a regex, you can regex as well. I do, from now on, suggest doing the whitelist and explicitly add whatever entities you want to actually generate that. And it's pretty simple where you go through and you move over whatever things you want to generate. So if I want to start generating AI builder file, move it over I can. You can select multiple things, holding down shift. You can add control, holding down, and do all that stuff. So, and yep, I didn't save that. So make sure you save it. If you do want to do that, Xing will not save. You want to click save to do that. So, and refreshing will refresh the metadata. So if you happen to add a new class and you don't see it, you can refresh it and be able to see that new table being generated. Entities wildcard whitelist. So this is the same thing as the blacklist. Hey, these are the ones I want to include. So let's say you want to, and they'll combine these things as well. So let's say that I want to include anything that's my own company name. So your XYZ, I want to include, by default, give me everything that I create. Like that. So give me everything that has this prefix. And that way you can automatically include those without having to explicitly call those out. And then just so we have attribute name overrides, we can override the class entity names. And so it'll use by default the schema names, except for these one or two issues where you want to overload it. That's great. Again, I recommend using the camel casing features available under the global. The entity's relative output path, choose what you want. Again, it's relative to the XML file here, but this is the path that it will generate all your files to for your entities. So for example, in mine, everything's under the entities. As far as the entities, the option sets and the messages are in different folders. Generate anonymous type constructors. So sometimes when you're trying to do a link query, it gets kind of annoying for that because you can't set some particular values. There is, let's see, where is that at? Yeah, so you can do a anonymous constructor here to be able to call out specific, to be able to do like a projection of specific items in that. So it's useful for link. If you're not using link, probably don't need it. Make it use it a little bit more. So that's one thing you can turn off if you're not using. All right, generate constructor to match Microsoft XRM entity constructors. So by default, the model builder doesn't actually generate all your other constructors. So if I go back to the top here, so you don't get your GUID, you don't get your key name, an object name, or your key attribute collections. Like these aren't generated by default, just this empty one. And so turning that on allows you to generate these other constructors as well. Generate entity attribute name constants. So this is the static class that gets generated in here. I get to the top because I picked it for the long one. That contains all the late bound stuff. So as a part of generating the early bound, you do get the late bound names as well. So you can use those in your condition expressions if you need to. In other areas where you might need the actual logical name for things. Generate entity relationships. These are the relationships at the bottom here. Some people use them, some people don't. They're not required. They do take up quite a bit of room, but if you want to not generate those, you can do that. Generate entity type codes. These are the type codes that used to get generated in the CRM Service Util. I don't think they get generated anymore as part of the model builder, but they they would get generated and give the actual type code. The type code is specific to that environment, which means if you run it in dev, it's going to potentially give you a different type code in prod, which is really annoying. So I've turned this off by default because that's kind of dangerous, and that's where Microsoft's going as well. They want to encourage people not to use those because it's just dangerous to have different environments with the same exact thing, except the type code is different. Generate enum properties. Here's one that is very, very helpful when you are dealing with wanting to populate wanting to populate the option sets. So highly recommend doing it. By default, you'd have the option set as a property type, but this will generate the enum properties, and as you see, it will also generate these other two options here as well. There's a property enum mapping, where if you do happen to have local option sets that really belong to a global option set, and you want to be able to compare them easily, you can say, hey, I want this particular option set to map to that particular option set. And so that way you can be able to compare those in code easier. Now you have to make sure you're maintaining those as being equal, or else you could potentially get an issue where you don't have a compile error, but it does actually fail in your environment. But for this, is really simple for, hey, I want to be able to take this one, let's think out of the box stuff is probably helpful. Look at the address type code. You have it on account, you have it on contact, a couple other places, they're the same exact codes. You can't easily compare them because you got to actually cast them. If you went through and said, hey, these should use this global option set rather than local, you'd be able to generate them that way and compare them that way. So it makes life a lot simpler. The other thing it does here is the replace option sets with enum. If you are dealing with an old code base and the old code base had everything set to be option set properties rather than enum typed properties, you can set this to false, and it won't replace them. It'll create another attribute with a postfix of enum that is the enum typed one. So that allows you to be able to slowly upgrade or actually use that going forward without breaking anything existing by changing the type for the option set properties. All right, generate iNotify pattern. This is something that was done as a part of the original CRM service util. It's only useful, I believe, in WinForm stuff. So it's false. But it would go through and add to the actual property generation itself. It would go through and add notifications. That way you could be able to know, hey, this one property got notified. I guess theoretically, if there's something you're building where you want to know, hey, this got updated, you could do that rather than having to go through and look at the before and afters of the attribute collection after the fact. But yeah, anyway, generate iNotify pattern. Make all fields editable. There's two things that sound very, very similar to this. I could explain them. You're probably going to forget them anyway, but there are some fields that are read-only by default. So created on, modified. These are read-only by default and shouldn't be set, but you could get confused or could get annoyed when you actually want to set that in like a where statement to say, hey, I want this to be equal to that. And so yes, it's helpful to make those editable, and then make all fields editable. This is something that we'll go through and make everything editable except for these properties. And so you can turn those on individually, but that allows you to be able to set values you wouldn't be able to set before, like the full name, right? You shouldn't really be setting the full name because that's the addition of the first and last name. But for some things like unit tests, it makes it so much easier to be able to set those full names. So anyway, those are options there to do that. I already mentioned property enum mapping and replace. And service context name. So this is the context name that's used that contains all your services. So if you ever do any sort of link to Dataverse sort of stuff, you need that Dataverse context for that. Option sets. Option sets, you are first option here. Add option set metadata attribute. So this idea is on the actual metadata itself for the option set. Go to an option set here. You will see here that it specifies the option set metadata attribute afternoon 1. So it gives you the actual text value. This is very helpful if you want to do any sort of error logging or messages to the user and you want to have the actual text information, you can do that. You have the sort information, you can do that as well. That's primarily what it's used for. So it would save you from having to do an SDK call to go get that information. It adds more bloat to your generated files, but makes it a little bit easier to go look up the information. Yeah, so use it if you want it, but that's what that goes through and does is it generates that option set metadata attribute information. So generating the casing here, by default, Model Builder will just take whatever you have and join it all together. So if you look at this example of a label, this is a very long label with some capitals, blah, blah, blah. It's going to generate as blah. Where if you set this to true, it's going to treat each of these things as a word, and it's going to capitalize it appropriately so that it's much more readable. So highly recommend adjusting that. This is kind of an interesting one here. If you are upgrading from early bound generator v1 to v2, this will get set to true because it's going to actually go through and try to clean up your file. So this is me attempting to do the best I could for you to have a working building version just by upgrading and not having to go through and clean up files. So that will get ticked to true by default when you go and upgrade from v1 to v2, and then after it runs, it'll get cleared. So that is kind of an interesting one there. Create one file per option set, same thing as the entity. It's going to create one file per option set. And this is, again, this is for global in this case. Well, I think you can change it. So if you change it to true, it will group local option sets by entity here. Yeah, so this is the generate one file problem. Yes. So if you change it to false, then you don't get that option where it generates it as it's going to generate one giant file. So it was going through and generating a single file per every option set, but this one you actually want to generate it. If you want to actually group those into by entity, it would generate it by entity, if that makes sense. So you wouldn't see all these local option sets separately. It'd be, hey, these are the option sets for this, option sets for that, and it would be specified that way. Moving on, generate all labels. If you happen to be working in an environment where you've got multiple languages on those option sets and you want to be able to not have to do another metadata call, this will go through and generate the text attributes for those option sets for all languages as well within your org. So that's what that's for. If you're in a single language org, you wouldn't ever need to turn that on. Generate global option sets. So this is one where if you set it to true, it'll generate all global option sets. If you set it to false, it's still going to generate global option sets, only the ones that are used by the entities you've selected. The generate option set metadata class. This is the class that's used by the option set metadata attribute. If for some reason you don't need to generate that, you can turn that off. Maybe you've defined it yourself. Maybe you've added something to it, and so you don't want to use, you don't want it to be regenerated. You can turn that off and not have it generated. Although if you do set this to true, it will assume that you are referencing that correctly. Group local option sets by entity. So this is the option that say, hey, I'm going to take all these local option sets for that one entity and combine them into one. By default, actually, this is going to get overridden by the new feature in the model driver and the model builder that will go through and add all these option sets under the actual entity itself. So, invalid C# name prefix. If you do happen to have an option set that begins with a number, you need to have not a number. So that's the prefix that's used. If you want to specify your own, you can. You can actually update the formatting of things if you want. So this is the local option set where 0 is the entity schema name and 1 is the attribute schema name. So the SDK says, hey, I'm going to generate it as this, as such. The default is this, but the prefix, it used to be this. So there's different prefixes that it used to be. And so you may need to change that if you're having some previous code generated and you want to make it match whatever that happens to be. Or maybe you don't like the prefixes in between that and you want to join them. That's fine. You can configure that. Option set names. If there is an option set that has the exact same name as an entity, that will cause conflicts. And so it will overcome that by postfixing with an enum. But if you want to actually give it something else, you can give it a specific name as well. So you'd say, hey, this is the name that exists, the way it's generating now, comma, here's the name I want to use going forward. The relative path, I already covered that one. It's just the path relative to the XML file or the relative path specified in the global settings. The option set value language code override. If you want to specify a specific language code to use to generate your option sets, you can enter that language code in here. The transliteration relative path. So this goes back to the actually, no, it's not listed. This is it. This goes to the ability to be able to take characters that you probably don't want to be typing in your code, like with umlauts or accents or things like that, and removing those. And so that's what this transliteration does. It'll transliterate it from whatever that special character is for that specific language feature into one that's more C# friendly. And so that's really all that's doing, is saying, hey, here's the path to where these alphabets are. And then you can utilize that to pull in, based on the language code, to pull in the correct alphabet to be able to map the values for that. So there's a couple. Just search for transliteration in the history on the GitHub project, and you'll see people that have created some files, and I've added it to the early bound generator for that. So use CRM service state enum naming convention. So the PAC Model Builder changed the way this is done. But if you wanted to maintain backwards compatibility, you could without having to change your code base. So, option sets. Option sets. Messages. So messages are things that sometimes people don't use as much as I think they should. They're very, very helpful to be able to code code plugins. There we go. For calls to custom APIs or custom actions, that these to be called. As well as maybe to call that from a website or something else as well. So it just wraps up the request and the response for you in a nice manner. Same thing here as with the option sets and entities. Create one file per message. Turn that to false, and it will go through and create one giant file with everything in it. Generate attribute names constants. So this is the same constants that you have for the early bound entities, but for the attributes. Generate messages. So this would generate, so you can actually turn this off if you want, and it won't generate the messages at all. So when you generate, just do entities and option sets. Group messages, request with response. This used to have separate, CRM service used to combine them together in a single file. Actually, it should be separate files. It used to be separate files. The Model Builder combines in a single one, so you can choose to go the old way or the new way, depending on what you want for that. Make response messages editable. The properties of these aren't editable, which is really annoying because you can't populate them for testing and stuff. So anyway, or if you're actually in the actual plugin itself and you want to populate it, you can't. So that's how you handle that. Relative path, so messages will get output to, and then wildcard messages for ones you actually want to generate. And this is the whitelist, wildcard based, blacklist, and then the whitelist. So this one I'm only generating a single one just to prove what it is, how it works. You could specify explicitly which ones you want to include or not include for your generation, or use your whitelist and your blacklist. So it's a long video. There's a lot here. There'll be new changes coming forward. There always are new ideas, things to go through and do. But that's what everything is in a nutshell. And that's how to walk through and do all that work. Yes. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully if you need more information, please put a comment in the video, and I will add a response to the comment. That way everyone else can see it. And hopefully if you haven't used Early Bound before, hopefully you use it going forward. And thank you for checking it out.